We want to look for those subjective reactions that each child has, because not every child is going to act in the same way when they're exposed to a particular traumatic event. And we know that those different moments will affect their lives, their perspective, but also we're listening for changes in feelings, thoughts, and physiological responses.
Hello and welcome to our Partnership Perspectives podcast. This podcast is centered around child welfare training and educational topics, all with the goal of helping to support those already working in or with an interest in working in child welfare. My name is Stan Brazier, and I am the project director for the Learning Partnership between the Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth, and Families, or DCYF, and Rhode Island College. Our desire is to bring information from experts on a variety of topics, all at no cost to hardworking professionals and others. All of the views expressed in this podcast by both the host and the guest do not necessarily reflect those of the college or the department. Today, I'm very excited to get our first episode underway and speak with our guests about how trauma impacts the brain and what child welfare workers, as well as other social workers, can do with this knowledge. Trauma can encompass many things, as we all know, and can be both acute or short-term or long-term or chronic. Our guest today is Dan Harvey. Dan is a retired full-time assistant professor at the Rhode Island College School of Social Work, where he taught for 14 years. He is also the former director of the Certificate in Graduate Studies in Child and Adolescent Trauma for matriculated MSW students. He has a 12-year assessment in trauma and treatment practice, working with traumatized children and adolescents. Dan, welcome, and it's great to see you.
Hey, thank you, Stan, for inviting me to the podcast. I appreciate these opportunities to share information regarding the effects of traumatic life events upon children and adolescents. And since this is episode 1, let's talk a little bit about the definition of trauma and the different types of trauma, which is the concept that's slowly fading out with the support of research.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, let's lay the groundwork. Let's talk about, give us a solid definition. And I know we're going to also get into the 12 core concepts today, but talk to us about what really is trauma. We talk so much about it. There's little t trauma, big T trauma. It's the elephant in the room. Tell us what it is.
Well, first off, we have to start with the definition of trauma that was discussed back in the 90s by Donald Mickenbaum out of the University of Waterloo in Canada. And that discussion was expanded in a revised treatise of trauma by Judith Herman in the 1990s. And she has a seminal book called Trauma and Recovery, which I believe is in its umpteenth edition. It's been so popular since the 90s. And both of them define trauma as exposure to the threat of or the actual experience of severe physical or psychic danger or harm. And these traumatic events are so powerful, extreme, and harmful and or threatening that they demand extraordinary coping efforts. So that's taken directly as a quote from Judith Herman's book and some of the literature that Donald Mickenbaum has published.
Right. So thank you for doing that first. I appreciate that because I think it's really important to be able to, like I said, lay that groundwork. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about, or just give us an overview of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the 12 core concepts of childhood trauma that they developed? Because I think this is really applicable for the area of child welfare and social work in general.
Of course. So this comes out of NCTSN, which is known as the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Is considered core curriculum on childhood trauma, entitled The 12 Core Concepts. And these are particular concepts for understanding traumatic stress responses in children and their families, so that we need to understand the entire group as a treatment source. The nice thing about this is that NCTSN was established by Congress in the year 2000. So this is actually your tax dollars at work. And it's been wonderful in using some of their literature because they've taken the collaboration of frontline providers, researchers, and families and raising the standard of care while increasing access to services. So let's look at the 12 core concepts, and I'll go through them individually. They're grouped
Yeah, sounds great.
under certain headings. What's nice, I need to mention to your listeners, is that these 12 core concepts is part of a handout that's downloadable for free from NCTSN. And they can also take a course for free as long as they sign in, set up an account, and they can learn a little bit more about this in a more structured way. And many times I'll have some of the graduate students that I work with go through this as part of the certificate program in child and adolescent trauma.
Right.
So the first area is concepts for understanding the traumatic experience of self and what has happened for the child. So number one is traumatic experiences are inherently complex. Now this kind of sounds like a no-brainer.
Right.
That trauma is inherently complex. So what we also look at is how the events unfold in working with the child through the interview process and documenting that in notes, and know that there are varying degrees of objective threat. So we're paying attention to how the child may potentially be threatened. It can also go into details about any kind of physical violation. And we also want to include not only the abuse that occurs to them, but witnessing of injury or death. That can also leave an imprint upon the children that we're working with. We want to look for those subjective reactions that each child has, because not every child is going to act in the same way when they're exposed to a particular traumatic event. And we know that those different moments will affect their lives, their perspective, but also we're listening for changes in feelings, thoughts, and physiological responses. So with children, they may consider a range of possible protective actions during different moments. And it's really helpful that we understand how those protective moments have affected their perception of what has occurred to them. We also want to pay attention to the feelings of confusion, guilt, regret, and as they say in the literature on NCTSN, any kind of anger afterwards, because this is part of that myriad of inherently complex experiences that affect the children. We also want to pay attention to something called moment-to-moment reactions. And that follows not only in this discussion, but in a number of the literature and the textbooks, paying attention to what happens moment to moment, because things can change very quickly.
Can you say a little bit more about that? So is that really looking at it as soon as that traumatic event happens, right away, we need to be paying attention to each moment in a literal sense? Or can you just explain a little bit more about what you mean by moment to moment?
So it may not be necessarily something that the CPI is going to ask because that gets into the therapeutic range.
Sure.
But therapists would potentially be asking the child to describe what had occurred to them.
Okay.
And the therapist will guide them to tell them what happened and then what happened next and how were you doing with that and what was it like for you. So the therapist would really be driving down and digging into what the experience is moment to moment for that individual child. And each moment to moment is going to be different from child to child or adolescent or even the family's reaction because that can change over time.
And I understand, too, that it's really important to try as best as we can to really make that, have that child or anyone really, right, only recount that once, if possible. Right.
If possible, especially if this is going to be an ongoing type of encounter where the child will have to repeat what it is that happened to them, we want to avoid re-traumatizing the child. And if there's a forensic child advocacy center that many cities have established, and a forensically trained clinician will ask them questions. And they have to be careful about that they're not leading types of questions. That's,
Sure.
What happened? Tell me what happened next. What did that look like? So that's recorded, and then that can be passed along to the legal system, the court system, so that the child only has to report that once initially. However, in certain cases, especially if it's a very complicated case, the alleged perpetrator has the ability, by law, to be confronted by their accuser.
Sure.
So there are times when we cannot stop children from going in and talking about what happened to them. They actually have to confront them. And that's very difficult for children to be faced with their alleged perpetrator when they come into a court.
Yeah.
You can advocate for maybe the courts to have a private session with one of the judges, but many times Once the information comes forward, the alleged perpetrator is not going to ask for anything, but sometimes it does happen. So you have to be available and ready to support the child.
So traumatic experiences are inherently complex. We've sort of established that as number one, right? So number two talks a little bit about trauma occurring within a broad context. And I like how these kind of all dovetail, but so why don't you kind of walk us through number two?
Sure, of course. So as number two states in the literature, trauma occurs within a broad context that includes children's personal characteristics, their life experiences, and current circumstances. So what we're doing is we're taking a much broader picture of how they're reacting, but also there are two key factors that we want to dive into, and that is child intrinsic factors and child extrinsic factors. So we're looking at what the strengths are that are inherently in each child or adolescent that we're working with. And those are child intrinsic, embedded in the child, something that they've used most of their lives. They're survivors of a particular type of abuse. And then the child extrinsic factors are those that are surrounding the child and the family that we would want to rely on in order to help that particular family unit to be able to overcome what has occurred to them. Child intrinsics factors are kind of like temperament, what happened in a prior exposure to trauma, prior history of psychopathology, and then extrinsic factors including surrounding physical, familial, community, and cultural environments. So remember, as social workers, we are the strengths-based profession, and we're always looking for the strengths within a situation that will eventually either help in the moment or be able to use down the road in order to help the child overcome what has occurred to them.
Right. That's what I was going to say, right? That context, sometimes that context could have a negative impact, but sometimes it could have a positive impact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what's also important to recognize is that you want to look at the child's appraisal of what has actually occurred and what there are expectations. And we're going to do a deeper dive into danger and safety, protection, and what type of adjustment needs to happen post-trauma.
You mentioned perception. Generally speaking, when it comes to the interview of a child, their perception versus reality, is there a lot of discrepancy, or does it depend on the age or developmental level? Is there sometimes confusion about what actually happened?
Mm-hmm. Those are really good questions. So when I was conducting child abuse assessments, prior to asking them questions about what had occurred to them, I'd be asking specific series of questions to determine their developmental level and what they actually understood.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I would do is ask them questions about what is their understanding of truth and lie, which are, kind of opposite concepts. Younger children might have a difficulty with the nuances of what the difference is between truth and lie. So it's important to recognize developmentally how are they interpreting that concept. Also, whether or not children understand what's real versus pretend. Sometimes children may have a particular memory that occurred as a result of what they're repeating, but may not necessarily have happened. So we would want to check the difference between real and pretend. Do they know the difference?
Sure. Yeah.
So these developmental milestones really need to be established as you're moving forward. And if these don't come forward, then your clinical evaluation may not necessarily be on solid ground, because if the child doesn't understand particular concepts, that's difficult.
Right. Because it goes back to that inherent complexity of the situation, right?
You got it. You got it. And one of the other things I would check on was what is the nomenclature that the child uses for understanding what occurred to them. So naming not only who was involved, and if it involved a type of sexual abuse, what kinds of words do they use to describe their body parts? So as an example, I'd want to know what the children referred to in names for their private areas for boys and for girls, and ask them. I'd get a little bit of maybe some cultural influence because parents would tell them these are the things that you can say, or encourage them. So if I'm asking a child what had happened and they use different kinds of words, something may sound very subtle and not be abusive at all, but when they're able to describe what had occurred to them, you get the full nuance of what it is beyond the nomenclature or the cultural values that were established.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay.
So we're also looking at vulnerability factors, which might make the adverse effects of trauma on children's adjustment even worse than what's going on.
Right. Right. So what about trauma generating more complexities, more adversities, life changes, etc. when we look at concept number 3?
So we've started off talking about inherently complex situations. This is where we're drilling down and moving farther out and looking at not only how the child is responding, but also how the individuals around them are reacting to things. But we want to make sure that we know what those secondary adversities are, those that get generated or some type of life changes. For example, if one of the alleged perpetrators was a family member and lived in the household and they become removed for safety reasons, how does that affect the family's functioning and the child's perception of what had occurred and whether or not the child potentially may feel sad or guilty about that happening? And that's usually the double standard sword that children have to walk, is that if it's a family member, particularly a parent or a beloved family member, not only their siblings, but an aunt or an uncle, for them to tell the truth about what happens may endanger the safety and the placement of where those other people are going to be. And the child could take on more guilt than they actually need to. So it's important that we recognize that secondary adversities can really affect a child moving forward.
Right. And I think about what might be some common things that people think about when they think, oh, that, a child was traumatized and now they're having additional challenges. They might think of things like they're taking on some of this guilt, or they might be lashing out for different reasons, but maybe they don't necessarily think of, so we were just talking about developmental stages, maybe reversals in development. Could that also be considered like a secondary adversity where a child is maybe actually regressing somewhat developmentally?
Yeah, regression is one of those signs that potentially the child is not able to manage what's happening in real time. Typically with things like sexual abuse, if a child had, by the age of 18 months or 2 years, had been able to attain the ability to control bowel and bladder, and then that all of a sudden reverses and the child is having difficulty and they're soiling themselves or urinating in their beds, that may be an indication of a sliding backwards, a developmental regression that you'd want to make note of and you'd want to pay attention to.
Right.
That in itself also creates secondary social stigmas, especially if the child can't manage themselves and they do something like this if they're of school age.
Sure.
That's very shaming for a child to have that happen.
That's just shot to the confidence levels, I'm sure, right? And self-esteem.
Yes. Yes. So making sure that when we're doing an assessment, we take into account all of those secondary adversities, because trauma and loss can tax coping resources of the child, family, and the broader community, and we want to pay attention to that. These adversities also can be sources of distress, as I just mentioned. Something happening to the child publicly could be very shaming, and we want to make sure that we don't add shame to anger, because then you get a child that's out of control. That's very, very explosive emotionally for them. There also can be trauma reminders and loss reminders. So when we finish with this grouping here, we're going to move to the concepts for understanding the consequences of trauma exposure and its aftermath, beginning with number 4. And that states that children can exhibit a wide range of reactions to trauma and loss. So we've already begun setting the groundwork for putting things together and being very clear. And what we want to do is look at what their wide range of reactions are to trauma and loss.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we just talked about a whole sort of continuum of different possible reactions, right? Lashing out, being more aggressive, reversing developmentally. What else should we be on the lookout for?
Well, for particular children, we want to look at PTSD symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, that can be not only generated by stress, but also by grief of something that has occurred. And we also want to make sure that the particular traumatic experience and its consequences, how it's actually affected. So we're asking questions about are there disruptions of some type in major domains of the child's development, including attachment relationships. What's going on with those? What are their peer relationships if they're going to schools? And are they able to be emotionally regulated? That's part of the wide range of reactions. If all of that comes tumbling down and they're no longer able to cope, that might be a good indicator that it supports something of a bad nature has occurred to this particular child. The trauma can also exacerbate pre-existing mental health problems that the child may have been diagnosed, including depression and anxiety.
Gotcha. Yeah. It's just a snowball effect, right? Yeah.
And then the focus really shifts in the NCTSN to danger and safety. And these are really core concerns in the lives of traumatized children, as it's stated. These can also know that children's sense of protection and safety can really affect their ability to perform. So I think of the classic example of if we have a child that we're working with that needs to be placed out of the home and they're placed in a group home, know that the entrance of that child into a new group home situation makes everybody in the group home go back to an earlier stage of functioning because this is an unknown entity, an unknown person. If you're used to using group dynamic concepts, this is where power and control comes in. And it may disrupt the harmony that a group home may have had because this single child has just entered. The kids that are there existing already know who's okay and who's a threat in their environment. Now they have a new kid that's coming in. It's like, WTF, what's going on with this one? How do we need to protect ourselves?
And the child that's coming in that's new, this could be a good opportunity for them to start feeling more safe, but they're not maybe necessarily going to be given that opportunity because they'll feel threatened by the other people because they're also in this new and kind of scary situation, right?
Right. So it's not, you have to remember that when placements are occurring like this, it's going to get worse before it gets better. But eventually, when things kind of settle down and the child who's coming in gets the supports that they need, as indicated by what we've assessed for their emotional needs and their safety needs, once those can be put into place, things will calm down and kids will be able to integrate much more easily.
Is that something you've seen more prevalent in group homes, or do you feel like that's also something to be on the lookout when a child is placed in foster care, especially if there are other siblings around, biological siblings of the foster family, and now a new foster child's coming in, or is it generally a better scenario, generally speaking, than a group home?
Well, it depends upon the previous relationship level with the family members. If a child feels comfortable and safe with a placement and it's kinship placement, that will be ideal.
Easier, yeah.
Yeah, much more easier. But if they're being placed with someone that they don't really know that well, say all of a sudden a grandparent emerges and says, I will take this child, and the child doesn't have a previous relationship, very similar kinds of things can happen. So we want to go back to group dynamics, theory, and knowledge, how those individuals are going to work together.
Right.
Part of this is also to prepare the new family members that are going to be taking in this child, not to personalize the child's behavior. The child is acting because of particular situations occurring to them that are a result of that traumatic event. So it's about the past, not about the present. So sometimes with foster care parents, I'll even warn them, you don't want to take this too personally. This isn't about you. It's about what happened to this child and their coping efforts to get through adversity in the previous placement. So knowing that, I think, is really helpful.
Yeah. Again, I love how these dovetail into each other because the next one is traumatic experiences affect the family and broader caregiving system. And we've already kind of started to talk about that, but tell us a little bit more about that one. We were just talking about, a grandparent relationship, extended family, any kind of kinship placement. How does that come into effect?
Sure. So as you mentioned, we are extending the effect to broader caregiving systems. Many times we want to look at what is the functioning of the child in school, versus their functioning at home. And one of the things I would use at this point in my assessment process would be using standardized tools, particular behavior charts to manage it, how the child is actually functioning in different environments. So I would be using a standardized tool with a parent or a caregiver. Sometimes we can even find instruments that work with teachers. So you're actually using standardized tool to assess every environment that the child is involved in. It'll give you a better sense of what's actually going on and where the deficits may be that need to be supported or plugged, those holes that need to be plugged in the environment. Sometimes I think of abuse histories that may be multi-generational, since we're getting into the broader caregiving systems, is that sometimes parents have their own trauma history. They can be triggered by their child's trauma event that's occurring in the present time.
Yeah, it's just like you just said with a child that might have some pre-existing mental health conditions, having those exacerbated. Same thing for the adults.
Right. So now with this one, we're turning toward what are the effects upon the parent,
Right.
as opposed to just focusing in on the child. So it's larger macro issues that we're paying attention to.
I can imagine it could create some resentment within families, especially when a child has to be removed and now grandma or granddad has to come in, or aunt or uncle has to come in and care for a child that they had no intention of caring for in the first place. So it's not only impacting maybe their mental health, but just a level of resentment and ill feelings towards the biological parent or parents.
Yeah, and on top of that, it's also what are the resources?
Yeah.
When you
Now
think of
their resources have to be stretched further than they were going to be.
right,
So.
when you think about older adults who might be grandparents and they're on Medicare and they're on a fixed income, what is it that the system can do that will support that family taking in this new child? So it's not only assessing what the relationship was, but also what are the resources that are available to support the entire family as they're moving forward. So related to that is number 7, which is protective and promotive factors that can reduce the adverse impact of trauma. Remember, in their definition, as they write in the document, protective factors buffer the adverse effects of trauma and its stressful aftermath, whereas promotive factors generally enhance the child's positive adjustment regardless of whether risk factors are present. So we want to make sure that we're reviewing the promotive and protective factors. Now, this also dovetails with 2 of the other concepts that we talked about earlier. Child intrinsic factors, such as high self-esteem and self-efficacy. And then, do they have a repertoire of adapting potential skills? Can they adapt to different environments? Those are intrinsic to the child. And then the child extrinsic factors are a positive attachment with a primary caregiver, social supports that are really important. Those kinds of things can get disrupted. If a child is taken out of their home, they have to go to another town or a city, and they're not in the same school system, they've lost all of their friends that they rely on to help them keep some level of cohesion. You can sometimes work through that with the local education. That person can somehow arrange for transportation back to the old school system, but it doesn't always happen. But I think that's been codified.
When you were talking about the sort of the first part of that, and I was thinking about resilience, and we may get into this when we talk in a second about culture, but what can a parent say or do to try to help build some resiliency for a child if no one wants to have their child experience traumatic events, but sometimes they can be unavoidable, no matter how, no matter what your resources are or socioeconomic status, right? But what are some things that a parent could maybe do or say to try to help maybe build some resiliency within a child?
Well, partially, the biggest factor is the level of trust, the existing level of trust that occurs. And this also extends to the child welfare social worker and the CPI. What level of trust does the child have with those individuals? And do they feel protected by them? So this is also part of that child extrinsic factor that we would be looking at. Parents need to approach it from the area of, I'm hearing what you're saying and validating their experience. They also need to remind them that they're there to protect them. And that can be really a very, very touchy subject. If the parent were in the home while the alleged perpetrator hurt the child,
Mm-hmm.
the level of trust may have been dissolved. And that means that more work needs to be done therapeutically between the parent or the caregiver and the child to support them.
Mend those broken fences.
Mend those
yeah,
broken fences.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and part of that is also to believe the child when they tell them what has occurred,
Mm-hmm.
and that the child will be respected for where they are and know that the parent or the caregiver still loves them and will continue to be there for them no matter what happens. Children need to have that type of assurance.
Right. So I feel like we have touched on this a little bit already, but tell us more about number 8, which is trauma and post-trauma adversities can strongly influence development.
Sure. So we did talk a little bit about this earlier, especially if there's developmental regression. Children's acquisition of developmental competencies can change. So we know that the effects of trauma can change a child's ability to exhibit developmentally appropriate behavior, as in that example of the regression. We also know that these adversities can also influence how their brain develops. So, when we're talking about the different areas of the brain that are affected, the limbic area is the area that we most readily will discuss, because that's where we have the amygdala, which is about processing emotion, along with the hippocampus, which deals with how to process memory. And those two factors of memory and emotion come together as a protective factor. But for some children, that's almost like turning on a switch, and it makes them look as if they may have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It can be really confusing to not only the clinician, but the parents, because you have what is a hyperactive child that's actually having difficulty reacting to their trauma.
Right.
And
it gets mistaken as something else that is probably so common, right? With misdiagnoses, missed signs, symptoms, things like that, thinking it's one thing when it's really a trauma response.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying it's either or. There can be ADHD symptoms that accompany the trauma, but then those symptoms get exacerbated because the trauma was so difficult for them to deal with. So when you see a change in developmental disruptions in the form of regressive behavior, reluctance or inability to participate in developmentally appropriate activities, those can also be signs. In certain children, it also can be manifested in precocious sexual behavior. Some children absorb the behavior that occurred to them, and it's important to identify that so that if there are younger children around that particular child, that the younger children are protected from the child who exhibits that precocious sexualized behavior. Because it may be the difficulty that child is having to wrap their brain around what occurred to them. So in order to do that, they have to repeat the behavior. And then you have more potential victims of that initial sexual abuse incident.
Right.
So we also want to make sure that age, gender, and developmental periods are linked so we understand the risk or exposure to specific types of trauma.
Right.
Then we're recommending paying attention to development. We also want to look at number 9, meaning developmental neurobiology underlines children's reactions to traumatic experiences. So their appraisal and ability to respond to danger also can be linked to their developmental neurobiology. And if that gets disrupted, this is like there are holes in the radar, and the child can't recognize what may be helpful or harmful. And that's something that the clinician working with them would need to pay attention to. And they'd also have to have a good relationship with the family member to gather ongoing information about how the child is handling particular situations. And if they're able to have contact with the school teacher, sometimes it may involve the child being referred to the school social worker if the behaviors are really not really helpful, but making sure that the clinician has an opportunity to talk with the school teacher.
Is this kind of where the fight, flight, or freeze, and I believe there's a fourth one now, is that where this kind of comes in?
Yeah, this is related to fight, flight, freeze, and then the fourth one that was added fairly recently is FAWN, F-A-W-N, which is an attempt by the survivor of the abuse to placate the alleged perpetrator. And we might see that more readily in domestic violence situations, and where the spouse is trying to control the behavior of one of the members of the couple group.
Gotcha.
So we want to make sure that we pay attention to those traumatic experiences that are left on the body of the child, because it may change their developmental neurobiology in ways that we hadn't expected. So we also want to take into consideration multiple traumatic experiences, because those build up after time. But I don't want to give the impression that if a traumatic experience only happened once, that's better or worse. It is what it is, and that's why we have to pay attention to the children, what their behavior is, what they're telling us, in order to get a well-rounded experience of what the traumatic experience has left upon their development.
Right. We don't want to minimize or overestimate any one experience or multiple experiences, right? Is kind of what it I think of when I think of that. So
we also want to take into consideration neuroplasticity. And that as the child ages, their neuroplasticity to accommodate particular events, including the trauma, is important. And how can we assess that neuroplasticity? And usually that comes about by observing behavior and what occurs to the child, and then using those standardized tools. Because if you see a regression in particular behaviors and it's consistent across environments, that's a pretty good indicator. There's something going on.
Right.
And we want to pay attention to it.
So what about culture's impact?
Well, this is under the heading of guiding concepts for intervention with trauma-exposed children and families, that we need to take into consideration culture, which is usually closely interwoven with traumatic experiences, responses, and recovery. So we always want to make sure that we're paying attention to what is the culture that the child is embedded in, especially if they're non-white. What does that culture say about this particular type of violation or abuse? And how would they handle this? That will be very informative to the clinician that's working with them, and see if they can support the family in a way that also may give them direction onto where that type of training needs to occur. There are particular situations where individuals come from other countries and they don't define trauma in the same way we would. So we want to understand, how do they characterize what a particular type of traumatic event is about and where it happens.
And there's no right or wrong response, right? It's everyone is different, and there's no good or bad.
Correct. This is what it is. We need to know what this response is, and how we can use that as a specific strengths-based perspective, moving forward. But there can be a time when another culture, for example, around physical behavior, correction, spanking, things like that, may be
more
very
accepted.
It's more accepted in another country.
Sure.
And we want to be aware that the parent understands the volatility of that, not only to the traumatic experience of the child, but what it may mean legally to the child welfare system if they're engaged in some kind of physical altercation with their child.
And also we know that just seeking mental health treatment, addressing mental health, can be more stigmatizing in certain cultures than others too. So even just a traumatic event might happen, and then trying to seek treatment might not be looked at as something that you would do in that culture necessarily. So.
Yeah, because that may be a violation of the privacy of the family, that you don't talk about this stuff outside of the house.
Talk about it, right. Yeah.
So, part of this has to be not only assessing, but also some psychoeducation about it.
Right.
We also want to make sure that the culture that the child had grown up in, is there some type of historical or multi-generational trauma that occurred? And we know that through the research that was done by Rachel Yehuda, when she was assessing survivors of concentration camps in Germany, that their DNA changed, and biologically they were less able to manage particular stressors. And then she studied their offspring, and they had DNA markers that indicated they had difficulty managing particular types of stressors. And now she's assessing the grandchildren, looking at how multi-generational abuse or the effects of one horrendous situation like the concentration camps, like what happened to Jews and other ethnic groups in Europe, may have laid across the DNA
Right.
markers.
It's kind of makes me think of someone, struggling with high blood pressure or high cholesterol because that is in part hereditary, right? They have everything that they do or try to do to try to mitigate it can be that much more challenging. So I think of it in a similar way where if they're trying to mitigate and address some of the trauma or mental health issues they might be experiencing, it's already embedded in them. It's just been passed down from them. So it just makes it that much more difficult. So
That's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah.
And sometimes the way those things have been embedded also are affected by rituals, cultural rituals that may not necessarily be supportive in this culture, in this country, legally. And then once we help children to mourn their losses in a culturally appropriate way, we want to move on to the challenges in the social contract, including legal and ethical issues affecting trauma response and recovery. And that would be core concept number 11. So we also think of particular traumatic events as being a major violation of the expectations of the family. Like, this isn't supposed to happen to families.
Right.
This isn't supposed to have happened to us. What are the primary roles that people are going through, including their interactions with the legal system? If this may be the first time that they've had to go to court or talk with a lawyer or be involved with police, what is the expectation of that particular family that's a violation of the social contract? Not everyone expects that a family is going to have a difficult time. So the expectation for families is that a couple comes together, decides to have children in whatever way is most helpful for them, and that the nurturance and the love of the relationship extends to the children. And abuse is not part of that social contract. And then what response has to happen after that particular type of abuse that may be a violation of the social contract. And no child expects themselves to have to go to a court and to testify in front of a judge about a very intimate, traumatic situation that occurred to them at the hands of a family member.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think we also talk so much about building trust and how important that is for child welfare workers or social workers, but you're that much further behind the 8 ball, right? When a system comes in and makes it, even if it's not really what they're trying to say, right? But the perception is, or maybe the perception might be from the parents or the family that you don't know how to parent or you don't know how to care for your children effectively because you have either abused and or neglected them, or at least there's this allegation of abuse or neglect. And so the parents have lost faith in that system. And so now as the representative of the child welfare system, you want to build the trust, but you're already behind the 8 ball because they've lost the faith and they've lost the trust in you.
Right. So being consistent with how you support the family is really important.
Right.
Whatever you say you're going to do, you better make sure that you do it and you do it on time.
Yeah.
Like if you're saying, I will come and see you on Friday at 3 p.m. and you get stuck in traffic, you want to call ahead and say, I'm going to be 10 or 15 minutes late, so that they know you're paying attention to the time and you're valuing their time as much as you're valuing your own.
I know. I sent you an email, Dan. I was running a few minutes late. All right. How about number 12? Let's take us home.
So number 12 is about us as members working within the child welfare system. And let me read this out loud. Working with trauma-exposed children can evoke distress in providers that makes it more difficult for them to provide good care. So mental health care providers also need to deal with whatever has happened to them, that there's a possibility that they may have had a history of some type of abuse. And what have they done in order to manage their reaction to that abuse that occurred to them? Are there similarities in the cases that they're following? Are they being triggered by statements or particular situations that have gone on? And this is not to say that the child welfare worker then talks to the family or the child about what happened to them, but they need to go to a respected confidant.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that is a supervisor. Sometimes it's a colleague that a child welfare worker is working with. Sometimes it's individual therapists.
Mm-hmm.
So they need to take that together and recognize what's happening externally in this situation of abuse that's affecting them.
Right.
And it may affect them at a particular level that they didn't expect. So I want to remind people of Bessel van der Kolk's treatise, The Body Keeps the Score.
Mm-hmm.
Moving forward, we are the sum total of all of our life experiences, and it depends on how we respond to those life experiences that will also show how we're able to manage moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're confronted by a particular situation where the family members evoke strong memories of personal trauma, that's our signal that we need to do something for ourselves. So I usually suggest that child welfare workers look at secondary traumatic stress markers and put together a plan for taking care of themselves on a regular basis. This isn't something that you wait for the particular situation to get out of hand. It's something that you want to build into your schedule and do it every day.
You don't want to be reactive. You want to be proactive on
Exactly.
this. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that may mean learning to breathe,
Mm-hmm.
not holding your breath.
Mm-hmm.
It also means drinking fluids like clean water,
Mm-hmm.
getting enough food, exercising,
Yeah.
being really careful about how much sugar you're putting into your body, because sugar is one of those things that disrupts natural systems very easily.
Mm-hmm. I think it's general self-awareness to, mental, physical, emotional reactions that you might be having, because I've had that experience too, where even recently just sitting and doing a training on suicide prevention and then realizing later in the day that I was affected by it, but I didn't really recognize it at first, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just that's an ongoing challenge, right? Is doing that work around self-awareness and saying, oh, hey, time out, like, I have a headache, or I feel stressed, or I feel really down about that, and thinking about why. I think we often don't think about the why as much as we probably should.
Those are excellent points that you're bringing out, is to improve our own self-awareness about how we're affected by particular life events that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
And this is being exposed to our work situations. And there are times when those can be very overwhelming, and you might need to make sure that you're relying not only on your own intrinsic
Mm-hmm.
strengths,
Mm-hmm.
but also are there other resources that you can go to that would be helpful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also like what you said, talking about the body keeps the score, and what we are the sum of our whole lives. And so every day, each one of us is waking up with that scorecard, right? But you can't see that. No one can see that. We can't look in the mirror and see all of our past experiences and past traumas and stuff like that, but it doesn't mean they're not there.
Right.
So I really like that too, because it's so much harder to have that self-awareness and have that visualization, because it's not a cut, a bruise, a broken bone, anything like that. You can't see it, visually see it, but it's there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
And developing that internal self-awareness, that when you're feeling uncomfortable about something, that's usually an indicator that there's something that's there that you need to pay attention to.
Recognizing those warning signs, recognizing those triggers.
Right. It's your body, kind of pointing at you and saying, you need to pay attention to this. Yeah. And that's not always easy, especially with, the type of work that we do in child welfare. You're being bombarded all the time by all sorts of messages and signals.
Nonstop. It's overwhelming, right? Yeah.
So good point. Take care of oneself.
Right.
And be aware.
Dan, appreciate it. Thank you. And we'll hope to have you back soon. Any final words or comments?
No, I'm just appreciative that you asked me to be here. And
of course.
And I hope that the people that are listening to this, if they have any questions, they can certainly rely on sources. NCTSN is good.
Yeah.
And to continue to attend the workshops and get some experience and knowledge through those.
Right. Right on. Awesome. Thank you, Dan.
You're welcome.